Our final speaker of the day is Sue Doyle, Head of Industry Programs, OAT Systems, a division of Checkpoint. Sue will be talking about automating processes in harsh environments via RFID. She'll be sharing case studies and ROI metrics. And the screen is yours, Sue.
Thanks, Debbie. So we're the deployment guide sponsor for this session, so we're going to talk about deployment, surprise, but also talk about many of the trends that we're seeing this year in terms of RFID deployments. And we are seeing somewhat of a shift in terms of how RFID is being deployed in harsh environments across industries. So I'm going to be talking about overall trends and also go into some specific case studies for oil and gas, being Petrobras, for aerospace and defense with BAE Systems, and then GE Global Research across industry. And then some common threads and some best practices for getting started or expanding your RFID deployment. So a little bit of background about OAT Systems. Many of you know us as OAT. Some of you may know us as OAT, a division of Checkpoint. We were founded back in 2001 out of the MIT Auto ID Center and built the first RFID commercial middleware platform. And we were purchased by Checkpoint in 2008, and we're a division of Checkpoint, which is a much larger public company that has given us more resources and also given us some exposure and some experience in the retail space that was not perhaps the biggest focus for us as a company. So we continue to operate across industry. What's interesting is that the complexity of retail deployments, the fact that if you look at industrial deployments, we may be servicing 20 facilities, 50 facilities for one company. In retail, you're looking at hundreds of locations, maybe thousands of locations, and you may have tens of thousands of employees who are interacting with RFID. So it really has forced us to think about the size and scale of RFID deployments and how to make RFID deployments sustainable, how to make sure that as you bring more users into the fold, you're focusing on continuous improvement, employee training, and you're making RFID visibility part of the business. So in terms of RFID deployments, we are in 6 out of 7 continents with RFID, and we do deploy a wide variety of use cases. The ones I've listed here are really applicable to harsh environments. Tool tracking, equipment tracking, WIP tracking, inventory management, MRO, shipping and receiving, tracking of materials management, as well as some of the regulatory requirements such as ATA 2000 compliance. So what we're seeing, and I did talk about this a little bit at RFID Journal Live in April, which feels like much more than a month ago, is that the way that RFID is being justified in corporations is shifting. It used to be that certainly up until a couple of years ago, RFID was justified in terms of cost reduction, which is in the back room. How can we get more visibility into WIP so we can reduce our capital expenditures? How can we get more visibility into inventory so again we can reduce our working capital and that inventory on hand? How can we focus more on quality, safety, and risk reduction? What we're seeing is that the value has shifted, and at least the way that RFID is being articulated and RFID's benefits is shifting much more to customer-facing processes. So if there is a customer-facing process such as an important program or a work order, increasingly in manufacturing we're building to order, not building to stock, or something like MRO operations where we're actually factoring in turnaround time of aircraft with a customer waiting in the wings, then we're focusing much more on revenue growth, and we're focusing much more on highly visible operations. The reality is customer-facing operations is how we're justifying RFID today and how we're getting budgets and how we're proving the value. At the same time, we can't service the customer without getting our backroom in order, without getting our operations in order. So if you look at WIP visibility and work order management, if I have a customer who is part of a big who has signed on for a big program or new product line, they're going to want WIP visibility. So instead of justifying it as WIP visibility, I'm justifying it as the value of the contract. So a good example of that is Orbital ATK, who spoke at Journal Live last month. The Airbus composites business it basically comprised about $1 billion in revenue for the company, which is pretty sizable. And therefore, Airbus wanted with visibility, they wanted to know what was going on. Orbital ATK wanted to deploy with visibility, but with a customer on the other end, a highly visible customer who was with a sizable contract, it was a way for them to justify RFID at another level and at a higher level in the organization. So how do we all define RFID in harsh environments? Harsh environments have unique characteristics. They are across industries, but basically you're looking at something which is remote. It could be outdoors. It could be under the sea. It could be underground. It could be in the air at 33,000 feet. It could be extreme temperatures, which we've heard quite a bit about today, chemical radiation exposure, which HID Global and OmniID have talked about in length, and multiple handoffs, where you have a chain of custody and you're not always in control of the whole ecosystem. So what do these have in common from a process standpoint or RFID deployment? We're looking at complex operations. If you look at oil and gas, for example, it's everything from exploration and production, E&P, all the way to retail outlets. That's a very complex operation, a complex supply chain. You're also looking at very high value assets. You think about how many billions of dollars industrial companies have with equipment in the field at multiple locations, decentralized. And you're also looking at high risk. With high reward comes high risk. Companies in harsh environments are doing things that are a little bit on the edge, and they need to mitigate risk. And having an audit trail, having documentation, having exception handling in place can make a big difference. So we're seeing what I would call RFID in harsh environments version 2.0, to use a software term. So if you look at the three boxes I have at the bottom of the slide, the first thing that many companies tried to do with RFID, and are doing so today, was how do I automate the management and increase the utilization of my capital assets? Once they get that under control, they're starting to, if you see the middle box, look at multiple use cases, multiple processes, and they're also dealing with multiple modes, because what works out in the field in terms of a modality may not be the best choice for a warehouse. For instance, Petrobras uses RTLS for subsea operations, and they're using passive RFID in the warehouse. And so we're seeing in the third box that there's a greater need for efficiency, integration, and data management. So we're seeing as RFID becomes more pervasive, as we look at adjacent use cases, there's a need to bring together the data, bring together the processes, and start to gain additional efficiency and get more synergy from multiple parts of the company. So I'm going to walk through briefly an example of Petrobras for oil and gas, BAE Systems for aerospace and defense, and GE for industrial manufacturing. And all three presented last month at Journal Live, and I'm also referencing the actual presentations they gave. I'm giving you the short version and giving you links so that you can go back if you're interested and see what was in the presentations. One of the things that I noticed at this year's Journal Live, and every year we see a greater adoption of RFID, is that the use cases are getting wider and they're getting deeper. People are looking at adjacent use cases. People are looking at getting value above and beyond their particular process, their particular product, their particular department, their particular function, which is really encouraging. So as we talk about oil and gas and Petrobras, this is a report I saw a couple of weeks ago that was published by EY, who is one of the major consultancies in oil and gas. And they did a survey of C-level executives in oil and gas, and what they discovered is that this year, 2015, there is a real focus on operational efficiency and cost reduction. The last few years in oil and gas have been go, 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 and growth, growth, growth. And that means lots of rapid hiring. Your budgets are going to go up. You're going to source more. You're going to purchase more assets. You're going to hire more people. And you're going to be focused on that. But you may not always be focused on how you're going to manage those assets, how you're going to manage those programs in the level of detail that you would during leaner times. So what we're seeing now is it's a reaction to all the money that was spent in the field, how do we bring that back, and how do we learn from that, and how do we run more efficiently? So that's certainly a trend that we're seeing in oil and gas. So Petrobras spoke at Journal Live last month. In that gray box is a link to their to the video recording. And if you were like me, you had trouble dividing yourself into 2 or 3 pieces to see every session you wanted to see. So these are really useful. So just to give you an overview of Petrobras, Petrobras is a state-owned oil producer in Brazil. I believe they're the 5th largest oil company in the world. And they operate over 200 vessels for oil exploration and distribution, and they actually manufacture their own vessels. So they're also a discrete manufacturer in that respect. And they have all the challenges that go along with that in terms of tracking work in process, managing shipping and receiving, managing service and repair, and also managing capital inventory. Last year alone, they shipped over 3.5 billion tons of cargo. So that gives you an idea of what sort of the size and scale of their operation. When they first implemented real-time visibility, they looked at subsea operations, and which is the left side of this. And they implemented RTLS solutions in those remote locations. Now, as they're implementing RFID in other areas of the business, they're implementing passive RFID and other modalities. So one of their key focuses moving forward is how do we integrate that information? How do they integrate it on a common data platform? How do they integrate the information? How do they integrate the sensor platform data? And how do they pull together process automation from point solutions to help across the board? So one of the things they have done is create an RFID showroom and laboratory where they can test out tags, systems, processes, software, hardware, and put together a best practices, they call it a cookbook, of what's working in one area, what's not working in another area, how do we bring things together, and how do we find commonalities between different parts of the business. So as a perfect example, they're doing a lot of tag testing, and they have many, many different types of assets, as you can imagine, out in the field and also in manufacturing and distribution. So they had almost as many different types of tags as they did types of assets, which does not provide economies of scale. It certainly doesn't help in terms of sourcing, testing, coming together with best practices for adhesion. How do you adhere the tags to the assets, and then how do you encode those tags and reap the data benefits? So one of the pages in the cookbook I think I have later in the presentation is they were able to take, I believe it was 14 disparate types of assets, and consolidate that into just 4 different types of tags that they use in the field. And again, that simplifies processes and simplifies implementation significantly. So let's move on to aerospace and defense. I feel as if I'm giving the industry grand tour, and BAE Systems. And here is a link to BAE's video recording from RFID Journal Live. And no, RFID Journal did not pay me for this promotional activity. I just thought it was very useful. So if you look at BAE Electronic Systems alone, and they're a division of BAE, they operate in over 20 locations in 5 countries. They have a lot of decentralized applications, a lot of decentralized functions, and that goes with manufacturing as well as servicing as well as distribution. It's a pretty complex enterprise. So when they started with RFID, they looked at, like many other companies do, how do I improve asset utilization? How can I track the capital assets I have? And specifically, if they are spread out across multiple divisions, multiple areas, and they're encompassing billions of dollars, how do I keep track of that, and how do I make the most of that? We had a reaction in the industry where CFOs started looking at their working capital and said, you know, why do we have this many assets in the field, and what are we doing about it? And how are we cataloging equipment that may be lost, missing, uncalibrated, broken? And how do we make sure that we can improve that utilization rate? That is a very fast way to improve one's balance sheet. So if you look at how BAE looks at equipment management, and that's their umbrella for that, they really started out with RFID on the second box from the bottom, which is automated tracking. They were doing manual tracking before, and they still do in some divisions. But as they started with automated tracking, it was how do we get real-time visibility of all our assets? How do we automate our asset tracking processes? And how do we increase our data accuracy? Because we've spent a lot of money on enterprise systems, we want to make sure they're updated regularly. Where they're starting to move now, and you can see there's higher business value, and as we move up the food chain here, is actionable data is the next box. Now that we know what assets we have, how do we start to do predictable availability of those assets? How do we increase the utilization of those assets? And how do we make faster, more responsive business decisions based on data? So in the case of equipment tracking, they're focusing initially on tooling, production tooling, and service and repair equipment, which is a pretty big area for them. And then finally, how do they optimize? If you look at the green box, how do they use this as a platform and use RFID as a platform for continuous improvement in the business? And how do they help improve the current processes that they currently have and look at some other adjacent applications? Because once you create efficiencies in one area, you may actually create a bottleneck in the next area, and that helps to justify an adjacent application. Now moving to GE. And GE really is a cross-industry player. In fact, I'm always surprised every time I look at GE again to realize how many businesses they have. Power and water, oil and gas, aviation, transportation, energy, healthcare, home and business, appliances, as well as their capital business, which I believe is spun off now. It's funny, if you look at the Fortune 500, Fortune 1000, GE is listed under their own category. They don't fit into any neat category. I think for a few years they were miscellaneous. That may have changed, or general, but they do span so many different businesses. And GE, when they looked at sensor visibility, they really had to look across all business lines. So GE actually presented in the Internet of Things track, and Linda Rose, who is one of the team leaders at GE Global Research, is the one who presented how they act as a resource for multiple lines of business. And there's a link to Lynn's video here. So how did GE look at process efficiency and RFID visibility across all those businesses? Well, they have GE Global Research is really a partner and a provider to provide an innovation resource across GE businesses. And they put together a concept called the Brilliant Factory at one of their GE Global Research Centers. They have 8 worldwide. And what they did was put together a lab to showcase, test, prototype, understand technologies like RFID, sensors, 3D printing, 3D graphics, robotics. What they're looking at is the fact that competitive edge doesn't come from just products anymore, it comes from systems and processes. So how could they build a better factory, a brilliant factory, and how could they provide these resources across business lines? So here's an example of an unusual case study that they did present. And this is actually a power and water plant in New York State that had been around for 100 years for GE. And the equipment was legacy equipment and actually had been around for so long that there were no PLCs as part of the equipment. There was no data at all. So they came up with a plan to put sensors on peripheral devices in that equipment and use those peripheral devices and smart sensors to track the information from that equipment to make the plant more competitive, more efficient, and to improve process efficiency. So it's really an interesting way of looking at an older manufacturing plant and older technology and how can we bring that into the 21st century. Interesting case study. So now that I've touched briefly on Petrobras, BAE, and GE, what's the common thread that we're seeing? Well, I think you should be able to see that it's integrating data. Now that RFID is proliferating more within organizations, how do you integrate the data from disparate projects? How do you make sure that you have a common sensor platform or a common way to collect that data and make sense of it? How do you establish best practices? So this little picture here with the flow chart is from Petrobras. This is how they went down to 4 different types of tags for all their assets. And how can you relieve the workload of individual business units? So not everyone is going to have the luxury of a GE Petrobras to have their own lab to test innovation across all business lines. But just by sharing with other functions and other divisions, you're going to get a lot more leverage out of your RFID project. If I think back to the early days of Airbus's value chain visibility project, they spent a tremendous amount of effort educating different business lines on the value of RFID, and they personalized it for each business line. And that really helped create momentum for the project and helped get internal spokespeople, internal advocates within each division. So taking on a leadership role, whether you are officially in charge of it or not, being able to share that information and share processes and best practices with other divisions can go a very long way. So getting started. If you are looking at starting RFID or expanding your project, it helps to, well, to distill this down, it's follow the money. What's most visible? What's most important to your organization? So customer-facing processes, anything that has to do with a customer at the end of the work order, at the end of the program, a customer overseeing a project for E&P or MRO operations, these are all projects that get funded faster and also have quantifiable results, deliver quantifiable results faster. The 80-20 rule, I would say most companies actually have a 90-10 rule, or more severe than that, that there's a small percentage of projects, programs, customers that comprise a very large portion of the business. So looking at where the most revenue and where the most profit is will help determine which RFID projects you request first. And then with opportunity comes high risk. So looking at any new programs, markets, where you mentioned Orbital ATK and their billion-dollar Airbus contract, that was a perfect environment in which to justify RFID automation. So what I'm trying to say is it's important to deploy RFID strategically by location, places that are hard to track, which many of you in harsh environments have. Anything near a high population center, we're seeing the same thing with field service and with retail. If you could be where most of your customers are, that's going to be a great place to deploy a project. Anything that's high visibility, anything that's a choke point for logistics. Or if you look at product line, any product line or program or line of business that has a high visibility, high risk reward, high velocity, high complexity, high value. Again, this is common sense, but again, if you follow the money, you're more likely to get attention higher up in the organization and also have access to budgets and resources higher up in the organization. We're going to be providing a deployment guide to all attendees and registrants in a few days. This is some of the content from the guide. We're looking at not just, we provide guidelines not just for tag selection, but also for the right type, the processes that could be automated, and then specific business cases and use cases and ROI drivers by business segment and by industry. So I'd like to thank you for sitting in today and thank RFID Journal and open up the floor for any questions.
Just about at the end of our time. However, we do have one. I know you talk fast, so we do have one question you might be able to answer. You made some very good points about getting started and how to deploy RFID strategically. But we do have an attendee that asks, what is your advice for companies just starting to look at how to benefit from RFID, regardless of the industry? Should they start with a small project, or do you advise deploying the technology strategically from the very beginning?
Well, again, don't try to boil the ocean or bite off more than you can chew. So I'm not advocating having the most visible product line or the visible project behind your RFID program. What I am advocating is don't hide it in a little lab or a little corner where there's low risk, because there's also likely to be less reward. So I would say go with a specific product line, a function or division, a line of business where there is a specific issue with, let's say, asset utilization or work order management. Get a specific business problem that's very specific, but also is going to be easy to grow longer term. So it's a small project, but it's a strategic project that has a lot of visibility.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Sue. We really appreciate it.